Week 9 is upon us. Bye weeks are here. 4 teams are off. 6 teams are off next week. You know what that means, folks? Roster management. It's here. It matters. And nobody does it better than your boys at the Fantasy Football Hustle. What's going on, everybody? Welcome in. I am Brian Drake, joined alongside Dwain McFarland of Establish the Run, MattWaldmanRSP.com, and FootballGuys.com. We are the members of the Full-Time Fantasy Sports Podcast Network. So thanks, everybody. As I fire up all our new crazy things, we're on Periscope, we're on YouTube, we're on Facebook. So thanks for joining us. Welcome in on a Tuesday night as we're recording this here on the East Coast around 6:15. So settle in, crack a beer, and Dwayne and I are going to take you through the next hour of fantasy football chats to make sure we're ready to go for the playoffs. Because, man, it's going to be here before you know it. Week 9 already. Dwayne, this season has flown by. I can't believe it's week freaking 9.
Dude, I'm telling you, I can't believe it either. And I keep thinking, we're going to catch a break, Drake, and maybe some of these crappy teams will turn it around. I mean, this is literally, it feels like the year of the haves and the have-nots more than ever before. I mean, just look at all the crappy football with all of these quarterback injuries. Seriously, the Bengals are 0-8. The Dolphins are 0-8. You've got the Browns at 2-5, the Broncos at 2-6, the Redskins at 1-7, the Falcons, for crying out loud, are 1-7. The Jets are 1-6. The Bears are 3-4, but their offense feels, like it should be 0-7. It's just, it's a crazy season. A lot of really, really bad teams that we don't want any part of for our fantasy teams. Unfortunately, I have some of those guys.
Oh, I know. And if you had James Conner last night, he had a great night for you. He went out there and put up well over 100 yards, but then he got hurt, busted up his AC joint. We don't know if it's a clavicle or not. More tests will follow, but the A1 player on your waiver wire this week should be Jalen Samuels. If he's not owned, put him in your lineup. He's going to get to go against the Colts this week. Probably will end up being a top 15 running back. If he's there, plug him in. We don't have to say a whole lot about Jalen Samuels. You saw what he did last year. So, Dwayne, all day I was hitting retweet or hitting refresh on my phone. I'm just waiting for Schefter to say something. Come on, who are the Eagles getting? Where's Robbie Anderson going? What's going on? 4 o'clock came. Nothing happened.
I'll tell you who the Eagles are getting. You're getting Deshaun Jackson back. That's what you need.
Very true. But no big trades like everybody was kind of hoping for. It's not the NBA. It's not Major League Baseball. One trade of note for fantasy that did go down yesterday is Kenyon Drake moving off of the Miami Dolphins, going to the Arizona Cardinals, who it seems like every running back on their roster just died. David Johnson, who knows what's going on with that ankle now, and Chase Edmonds with the bad hammy. They play Thursday night against San Francisco. The guy got there 5 minutes ago. I can't, in good faith, Dwayne, say plug him in your lineup and expect 15 PPR points. But here we are. Fantasy points are desperate at the running back position.
Yeah, I mean, if you're really in a pinch, you're just going to have to. The thing that I'll say for Kenyon Drake, is he's a good fit, right, for what they like to do. He's a good pass receiver. He's a good route runner. He's got some explosion to his game. So, I mean, it's a good fit for him. The other thing that folks, you just have to keep in mind is that Chase Edmonds was really coming on anyway. And we talked about this last week, even before, his 35-point PPR point, eruption in week 7, he had scored 15 points and 14 PPR points in the 2 weeks prior to that. So, this is something where the Cardinals have really been using 2 of their backs consistently for the last several weeks. And with Chase Edmonds probably out for a little bit, at least, there's an opportunity there for Kenyon Drake to really, take his role for a bit. Now, the worst thing that could happen is if all of a sudden this turns into a 3-man committee when all of the guys are back, which if you look back at the history, of Cliff Kingsbury, he did have years like that, at Tech, where he didn't really commit to any one back. I still expect David Johnson to be the lead back. I think Chase Edmonds is the 2 as long as he's healthy. But I think this deal with Kenyon Drake is definitely good in the short term, for Drake, especially, even though the matchup's bad, he's going to have to be the main guy this week. And then going after that, we'll see what happens.
If you're also tying at running back, you might want to look on the other side of this transaction here. And that was Mark Walton becoming the man in Miami. Don't worry about Kalen Ballage. he stinks. He's dead. Don't add him. But Mark Walton is going to get run. Last night, 11 rushes for a whopping 35 yards. But we're always scrounging for running backs, Dwayne. Mark Walton, if he's available, he's got a pulse. Barely.
And that yeah. I was just gonna lay out on you. Just act like my mic went dead. Yeah, Walton's a guy that I actually wrote about last week for Establish the Run, who had three weeks of positive trend data around his snaps, around his rushing attempts, his routes per dropback. So all those things have been headed in the right direction. So he was the guy that they were really starting to move to anyway. And now with Kenyon Drake, out of the way, he's going to continue to get more of that work for whatever that is worth on the Miami Dolphins. But if you just are in need of a guy that might have an upside of 10 points, Walton's your guy if you like that 10-point upside in a PPR.
This is where we are, though, folks, because think about it. This week you've got Falcons, Bengals, Rams, Saints all on bye, okay? So you're missing Freeman, Mixon, any of the Rams guys, Gurley and Henderson, and Murray and Kamara. Next week, we've got 6 teams off. So we really do need to kind of fill our roster with, if it's Mark Walton or Kenyon Drake, because next week, Broncos, Texans, Jags, Pats, Eagles, Redskins. These are a lot of skill position guys who aren't there right now or next week. So we got to be ahead of the game. We got to be ahead of our league mates. And that's the mantra of this show, is never get out hustled. So like I had a league this week. I flipped Deontay Johnson into Josh Gordon when he got set on IR, turned him into Kenyon Drake. So I took a bench wide receiver, turned him into a now starting running back. That's what you got to do, folks. Just keep hustling. So last week we sat here and every football show across the podcast universe said, pick up Ty Johnson. He is going to be put right into an immediate starting role. Top 15 running back. What an opportunity for Ty. He's a stud. Well, Matt Patricia pulled out the old Bellatrix and ended up playing 4 different running backs. Trey Carson got 19 snaps. J.D. McKissick got 16 snaps. And the ghost of Paul Perkins got 6 snaps to Ty Johnson's 25. We go to Dwayne because he is the king of the utilization report. What did your data say? What can we make of this mess?
Yeah, it's just what you said. It's an absolute mess. And we talked about this being a possibility, the week before. Essentially, Ty Johnson just took on all of Kerryon Johnson's role once he was out. But we had mentioned that, they didn't really have anyone else active besides J.D. McKissick in that game. So we couldn't be for sure how they were going to handle this going forward. And we know that, Matt Patricia is, somebody that, like you said, going back to his New England roots, we even saw this last year where he continued to play the LeGarrette Blount, despite the fact that he was, not being very productive. He had Theo Riddick out there, and he had Kerryon Johnson whenever Kerryon Johnson was really playing well last year, and he continued to use those guys. And he even talked about that this offseason. So, yeah, I think this is going to be something where we're going to continue to see it be a mix of players going forward. And honestly, Drake, I don't think you can use or start any of these guys until proven otherwise. If I had to say how I think the roles are going to work, it really appears that Ty Johnson, is probably going to be the kind of in between the 20s guy that does kind of everything, right? Mm-hmm. So, he had 28% of the rushing attempts last week, 42% routes per drop back. And then you had, Trey Carson leading the team in the rushing attempts. He had 48% of the rushing attempts. Not a big factor, on passing downs. Only 14% of the dropbacks did he run a route. And then, you had J.D. McKissick, who's really more, your receiver, right? He was also in a route on 39%, just a tad behind Ty Johnson. So it's almost like Ty Johnson is kind of that mix of a Rex Burkhead, James White. McKissick is like, the old Kevin Falk role. And then you got Trey Carson, who is kind of in that LeGarrette Blount role from last year. That's the way it, is kind of playing out right now. And then Paul Perkins, that just, he had 12% of the rushing attempts. That's just a pain, in the butt. If you've got 4 guys rotating through, it's just going to be a mess. So, and Detroit's running game just hasn't been that good. So it hasn't been that good all year, despite, a decent offensive line, or at least we thought so coming into the season. It just hasn't produced for us. And now we've got a situation where it's spread out across multiple guys. If there's one guy that I want to own in this mix, Drake, Ty Johnson's still the guy that I'm stashing. If I had to pick a second guy, it's got to be Trey Carson.
So what we're going to do here, folks, is kind of go hitting a bunch of teams, and we're going to give you the waiver relevant guys and fantasy relevant folks for each team instead of just boring you going through the waiver wire. Like, you can get that anywhere. You come here for Dwain's utilization info and his in-depth insights into these rosters and how the coaches are using guys. So that's what we're going to do. We're talking about the Lions. Let's go over to their wide receivers now. And don't look now, Dwain, but Danny Amendola played 68% of the snaps, 84 of them in the slot, and got 24% of the targets. Now, back-to-back weeks, he has 8 catches. I don't think this offense can sustain 3 pass catchers necessarily. A week ago, we saw Marvin Jones go off for 4 touchdowns. This week, Galladay looked good again. Amendola, though, has been that secondary option. I mean, if this guy is a top 15 wide receiver in fantasy 2 weeks in a row now, is this fool's gold, or is this legitimately somebody we should go pick up in a PPR league and start?
Yeah, you don't want to spend much on Danny Amendola. The only way that you can really peg Danny Amendola is if you can figure out which games the Lions are actually going to be either trailing or in a really close game in. Versus the games, where they're ahead, because that's really when Danny Amendola is getting on the field. They're using their 11 personnel when they need to. Some of it's matchup based as well, but he'll easily have games where his snaps and his routes per dropback are going to be down in the 50 and 60% range, which won't be enough to keep him fantasy relevant, right? So it just really depends on the matchup. It depends on the way that the game's going, because Detroit is one of these teams that likes to, and again, back to Patricia, thinking like Belichick. They like to really set things up based on their opponent and then the way that the game is unfolding. And these last 2 games, it's worked out well. Lost by 12 points in week 7. This last week won a close game against the Giants, where the Giants came back at the end, and they win by 5 points. But they obviously really loved the matchup. You could see it right out of the gate in this game. They love the matchup against the slot cornerback, because the Giants don't have any good cornerbacks, period. When you get to their third cornerback, it's really, really bad. And so that's what they were really taking advantage of, but if you look at the receivers over the last 3 weeks, Drake, so in week 6, it was 28% Galladay, 16 Marvin Jones, 3% Danny Amendola. The next week, it was 4% Galladay, 29% Marvin Jones, 22% Danny Amendola. And then last week, 25% to Kenny Galladay, 16% to Marvin Jones, and then 25% to Danny Amendola. Well, where's Hawkinson been? 19, 11, and 3. So there's going to be an odd man out each week. You're probably going to have 2 guys that get close to the 20% range, or if you're going to have one guy dominate at like a 25 to 28, and then that leaves everybody else sitting below 20. So it's kind of a tough, it's honestly pretty tough to figure out. Kenny Galladay's at 22% of the targets on the season, 19% to Marvin Jones, and then Danny Amendola's at 15%, and TJ Hawkinson's at 11%. So for Danny Amendola, he's a guy that it's tough for me to recommend Drake putting in. Now this next week, they're going to be playing the Raiders. The Raiders are really bad, in pass coverage. So they could go to Amendola, but they could just as easily go to Kenny Galladay and Marvin Jones. Mm-hmm. And honestly, it's a game that, Detroit probably should win. But the Raiders are it's probably fair to say that the Raiders are playing, about the same as the Lions are right now. So the game could be close. But for me, Amendola, unless I'm in a super deep league, I'm just not messing with it.
Matt Stafford, a guy you absolutely should pick up if he's out there. I think he's a top 12 play for the rest of the season, but if you need a streamer for this week, let's put him right in there. All right, Dwain, here's
absolutely.
something. Yeah.
Stafford, man, he's a guy we talked about a few weeks back, but yeah, we can move forward. We don't have to stop it down, but yeah, right now, I think he's ranked 9th in fantasy points, in a typical league format. So yeah, he's doing great.
So back in the day, 2 years ago, we talked about Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram and the amazing 1-2 punch they had in the Saints backfield. Could we be seeing similar in Green Bay, where Aaron Jones is now, I believe, running back 3 on the season, and this past week played 64% of the snaps to Williams' 46. He rushed 13 times for 67 yards to Williams' 7 for 22 and a score. What really put him over the top, though, was his 7 catches for $159 and 2 scores. But not to be outdone, Williams is catching the ball and scoring touchdowns. So we truly have 2 backs that I think you can plug in your lineup and play if you have either one of those. Obviously, if you have Jones, but Williams, I think, is a playable asset now for somebody.
Yeah, I think Williams is a flex play. I mean, if you talked about where the snaps are sitting, but if you look at, the rushing attempts, it's still clearly Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones, the last 2 weeks, 52% and 50% versus 13% and 27% for Jamal Williams. So with Williams, what you really need, you need a touchdown out of him, right? And now he got a carry inside the 5 this last week. He also had a target inside, actually a target in the end zone, which is kind of rare actually for running backs. You don't see that often. Aaron Jones had one the week before. So Williams, what you're looking for is you need him to punch one in, really, but he is being used down in that area. The offense, has really gelled. It's doing well. And so, I mean, I think they are both playable. Aaron Jones, is a top 3 runner in the league right now. Hey, and here comes my daughter. Your daughter crashed the show last week. So Zoe, say hi to, America, or some small percentage of America.
Hi.
How's it going?
So, Brian said, how's it going? Good.
Go Eagles.
He said, go Eagles. No. Go who? Cowboys. That's right.
If you guys didn't know, Dwain lives outside of Dallas. I live in New York, but I'm a Philadelphia Eagles fan. So we mesh very, very nicely here.
Yeah.
I'm actually going to the Eagles game this weekend in Philly with some of my buddies to see them play the Bears. So if any of the listeners out there are going to be in the Philadelphia area, want to drink, hit me up on Twitter at Drake Fantasy. Again, follow Dwain at Dwain McFarland and follow the show at FF Hustle. So this is the Fantasy Football Hustle, and we're breaking down some backfields, talking about receivers, seeing who we should be adding and dropping. And Dwain, I don't know how to go any farther than I have to stop at my own home team and say, Matt Breida is killing me. He's killing me, Dwain. Every guy in San Francisco scored a touchdown this week. Roger Craig ran one in. Matt Breida gets hurt if somebody breathes on him. What happened to RoboCop, who came in? He was coming in bandages and appendages falling off last season. Now, nothing. Yeah, the guy gets tweaked. He's out. Forget about it. 4 points for you. You're done. You're killing me, Matt Breida.
Yeah, it's just the injuries, that Drake. So, I mean, he tweaked his ankle on the last play, of the game. And so, I mean, he didn't play for the whole second half. And so because of that, that's really what happened with him. He only played 28% of the snaps, and then they were just blowing the other team out. So they had no need to do it. And if you look at Tevin Coleman was actually, his points all really came in the first half, Drake. 4 touchdowns. I think, did all of those come in the first half? Maybe one of those may have came in the second half, but 38 points. But if you look at him, only 48% of the snaps, 29%. My daughter's asking me, sorry guys, what's for dinner? I'll be out in just a minute, Zoe. Go in there. Go.
I thought someone was breaking into your house the way the dog was going crazy.
Sorry, I see what she's saying. She said the neighbor invited her for dinner. So
okay.
Sorry. Listen to me. I'm like, go. I'm like, why are you still in here? Tevin Coleman only played 48% of the snaps. He only had 29% of the rushing attempts, Drake.
Interesting.
I mean, 29% went to Breida, and then 24% went to Raheem Mostert. So, I mean, they were so far ahead. I think that was part of it. And then I don't know if you saw the note, but Breida, he did tweak his ankle at the end of I think it was the last play of the first half, and they just didn't use him again.
And I don't think he's going to play this week. They play the Thursday night game, and Shanahan came out today and he said, if they had to play today, it doesn't look good for Breida. And also Raheem Mostert hurt his quad, so he could be limited or not play on Thursday night, which opens things up for Jeff Wilson Jr., our favorite vulture from early in the season. Again, if you're totally desperate at running back this week because your running backs are Joe Mixon, Elvin Kamara, Freeman, and Gurley, and they're all on bye, Jeff Wilson Jr., maybe he falls into the end zone. God bless America.
I think the biggest thing here is that, Tevin Coleman, has got RB2, value probably for the rest of the season, at this point, because we've seen in the games where, when the 49ers haven't been blowing out other teams, but, they've been winning handily the last, the 2 games before their 38-point win against the Panthers, a 13-point and a 9-point win. We talked about this a little bit last week, 56 and 66% of the snaps, 44 and 51% of the rushing attempts. If you can get to 50% of the rushing attempts in this attack, and if you look at what he's doing in the passing game, on his limited work, he's his volume isn't quite where we would want it to be, but the 49ers have proven, right, that this rushing attack, is very explosive. So I think Tevin Coleman, giving all that's going on with all the injuries and everything else that we've seen in the league, he's probably a viable RB2, the rest of the way.
Let's go over to their receiving core now. Emmanuel Sanders joins the fray. Got 23% of the targets right out of the gate, 82% of the snaps, and a stat that you love to drop on us. He was in there for 100% of the routes per dropback. Do I have that correct?
Yep. Yeah,
that's insane for a guy that just showed up that week.
Yeah, and if you think about it, and if you look back at the history this season, no other receiver has done that this whole season. The closest was Dante Pettis in week 7. He got to a 96%. But it's very clear to me at this point, Drake, they go out, they grab Emmanuel Sanders, and within just a few days, he's in the lineup for every play. They just don't trust the other guys. Now, I have to, throw it out there that Marquise Goodwin was inactive for personal reasons. So there was one less guy in the rotation. So that could knock Emmanuel Sanders down a little bit. But I think we've got a situation here, Drake. I usually like a few more data points, but just given the fact that, this team's been cycling through these guys, giving everybody playing time, waiting for somebody to emerge, and no one has emerged. I think Emmanuel Sanders is going to be locked in as the number 2 target in this passing game for the rest of the season. He's a veteran. They're going to trust him. I think that's one of the things that we don't get to see as fans. We don't get to see what goes on in practice, but there's a reason that they don't trust these other guys. You and I, we can go watch film and we see, wow, look at Dante Pettis separate against man coverage. But, what we don't know is he ran a slant when he was supposed to run, like a 5-yard comeback. Right. Or he was supposed to run a 5-yard slant, and he ran a 3-yard slant, all the little things that they keep talking about with Pettis. And Pettis, man, his snaps dropped to 31%, routes per dropback dropped to 38%, Drake. And that's with Marquise Goodwin out of the game. And so Deebo Samuel did return. He was the second highest, Drake. He had 65% of the routes per dropback, and he played on 69% of the snaps. So right now, and, my gut would say that really this is going to be George Kittle, 1, Emmanuel Sanders, 2, and then a mix of Deebo Samuel and Goodwin as 3. But really, I would say the running backs, are probably the true 3s. I think that's the way it's going to work out the rest of the way. It'll be Kittle, then it'll be Sanders, it'll be getting the running backs involved, and then they're going to sprinkle in Deebo Samuel and Marquise Goodwin. If Pettis does happen to rebound, that's probably the role he finds himself in, unless Emmanuel Sanders were to get injured, or if George Kittle were to be injured, then that could open up more of a role for one of these other guys. But the bottom line is we're at week 8, Drake. This was the 7th game for the 49ers because they've already had their bye week, and just no one else has stepped up. And it's just clear to me that they're just going to give this to Emmanuel Sanders.
And he gets, I believe, Patrick Peterson and the Cardinals on a Thursday night. So even if he goes into the slot, we saw this past week, Peterson, who a lot of times doesn't travel into the slot, he did this past week. So we'll see if he gets shut down with old Patrick Peterson.
And they may not they may not do that this game just because, they may not be with some teams, the opposing team just doesn't shadow. Right. And it's typically a team where there's not a clear cut number 1.
Yeah.
Now
Michael Thomas, you're going to follow him around last week.
Yeah. I mean, they may be seeing the same thing we are. To me, it's pretty clear that Sanders, is the one. So we'll have to see what happens with that. But I think the good news is there's a lot of meat left on the bone in this passing game. The Niners have been really blowing people out. I don't know. I mean, I think they're a really good team, but I don't think they're as good as these blowouts have indicated. And if they get in some more competitive games, I think Emmanuel Sanders is going to have some value.
I can't wait to see the 49ers at some point this year when somebody really tests them and we get towards the playoffs and, when they're playing Green Bay and all these kind of guys in the playoffs. And I want to see Jimmy G have to sit back there and make plays. That's what we haven't really had to see yet with San Francisco because they've just dominated everybody so thoroughly. So that's exciting to me. And it's nice to see the 49ers. Ryan Hallam, our good friend at Fighting Chance Fantasy, his favorite squad. So good to see them turning it around. Let's flip to the other side of the Emmanuel Sanders trade, and that's Denver. Abandon ship, everybody. The Brandon Allen era has begun. Joe Flacco, after calling out the coaching staff and basically the entire organization, all of a sudden now has a neck disc issue on IR. Funny how that happens. So Brandon Allen's in, and everyone else get out. I don't want any piece of this wide receiver or tight end group from Denver at this point. Sorry, Cortland Sutton.
No, I can't disagree with you. I mean, I guess the only thing that I would look at, that I would talk about, the one guy that I'm seeing a positive trend on from Denver has been Noah Fant. His snaps have gone from 65 to 72 to 82%. His targets have gone from 11 to 15 to 19%. So in the first week without Emmanuel Sanders, he was the guy that saw, the increase in the target share, but now you got Joe Flacco gone. So I really don't know what that trend is going to be worth at this point. But I'm with you. It's just a situation that if you can just avoid it, it's pretty much a fantasy wasteland.
Similarly, happy birthday, Andy Dalton, because you've been replaced in Cincinnati. Ryan Finley is now the quarterback for your Cincinnati Bengals. Tyler Boyd, AJ Green, if he's coming back in a week or so, Auden Tate, Alex Erickson, goodbye. You're done. Your fantasy season just ended. I can't recommend anybody playing those two. And in a trade, because trust me, I have Tyler Boyd and I've tried peddling him all day, I don't know what you can even get for any of these guys at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the problem you have for a guy like Tyler Boyd, seeing the massive amount of targets, that he's already been seeing, just unable to put up, fantasy points the last 3 weeks, 4, 11, and 13, and the guy is seeing, he's seeing around 10 targets almost every week and sometimes more. So yeah, I'm with you. I think, Ryan Finley, the jury's out. I mean, we'll have to see. But, Andy Dalton really, it's not that he's a great quarterback, but he just really wasn't, the problem. He was turning the ball over. They just, they were just an offense that was just struggling to find any kind of cohesion. They were just struggling to really find their rhythm. And I think, it was just kind of doomed from the get-go whenever we lost, the offensive tackle, and then you lost AJ Green. It just really hurt the Bengals and put them, in a bad spot. A couple of, quick trends on the Bengals. And you had to kind of wonder, was this really around trying to, show somebody off for a trade? But Tyler Eifert, 71% of the snaps, that was a season high last week, Drake. 78% of the routes per drop back. That was by far his highest of the season. And it wasn't because he was taking them from CJ Uzoma, though. It's because they ran less 11 personnel and they used more 12. So Alex Erickson only played 61% of the snaps, whereas the 2 weeks before he had played 80 and 94%. So it could just be a matchup thing, but just something, to monitor if you're in a super, super deep league and, Tyler Eifert sitting on your wire, you need someone for your bye week. I can't guarantee you that trend is going to continue. Most likely what happened is Zach Taylor was watching film of the Rams coming to town, and they're like, oh, look how they're using, Gerald Everett. Maybe we should use Tyler Eifert a little more. And so that's what happened. He also saw a season high in target share, 17%. But again, like I said, I can't guarantee that that's going to continue. Auden Tate, man, this guy, Drake, leads the league in end zone targets over the last 3 weeks.
Interesting.
He's got 10 on the season, whereas Tyler Boyd's got 0. But yeah, he's got 7 over the last 3 weeks. Now, the Bengals are on bye this week, and we don't know if AJ Green will be back the following week. But it sounds like he could be, and we have a new quarterback in play. So, these trends are all there, and they're designing. It's apparent that they're designing things for Auden Tate, once they get down close to the end zone. But I don't think that's going to continue once AJ Green's back. I think he could still see some of it, but I would see things leaning more towards AJ Green. So again, that's a trend. It's there. I don't know how much it's going to be worth come 2 weeks from now.
If you like this kind of in-depth analysis, you're going to want to head over to establishtheRun.com. Use our promo code HUSTLE20. It's going to get you 20% off a weekly, monthly, or season-long package from the boys at Establish the Run. And that's where you can read Dwain's work. The utilization report in its full glory is written up every Tuesday. It's up there Tuesday, Wednesday usually, along with Evan Silva's matchup columns, some really in-depth podcasts. There's DFS items, the buy low, air yards model, rankings, you name it. It's all Establish the Run. More importantly, support us, support Dwain. Use our promo code HUSTLE20 at establishtheRun.com. Save yourself some cash and win leagues because, let's face it, Dwain and those guys know what the hell they're talking about, okay? So HUSTLE20, use the promo code so they think people actually listen to our show. Moving on. So moving on here, let's talk about some actual good teams. And in Kansas City, Sammy Watkins returned. 5 catches for 45 yards on 8 targets. He was in there for 86% of the snaps. Tyreek Hill was doing his thing, 6 for 76. All at the expense, Dwayne, at least through the air, of Mecole Hardman and Robinson, who only had 2 catches apiece. Hardman obviously did, get in the end zone on a rush. But what did you see from Watkins? How do you think it affected the offense? With a backup quarterback, mind you. It wasn't Patrick Mahomes, but it sounds like he's trending towards returning sooner than later.
Yeah, but basically it went back to what we saw early in the season before all the injuries hit. You have Sammy Watkins and Tyreek Hill in the 2 wide receiver sets, DeMarcus Robinson working in and many of the 3 wide receiver looks, although his snaps went down from 80% down to 64%. And you had Mecole Hardman really just more as the gadget player. He only played 15% of the snaps. He only ran a route on 10% of the dropbacks, saw 6% of the targets. He did come through, like you said, with a big play. But he's just not a guy you're going to be able to depend on. Now he's still worth stashing because we know that Tyreek Hill, Sammy Watkins, if one of them were to go down, and if in fact Patrick Mahomes makes an early return, anyone that's playing with Patrick Mahomes obviously has value. So he's still a nice stash in your deeper leagues. But if you're in a shallow league, you shouldn't really be holding on to Mecole Hardman this time. And then DeMarcus Robinson also is a guy that, you're not going to want to have in your lineup, but you can clearly keep him, on your roster in like mid-sized leagues to larger leagues. You want to keep him rostered, but in shallow leagues, you can probably even move on from DeMarcus Robinson.
How about in the backfield? It was the LaShawn McCoy show until he fumbled. And then, hey, back from the dead, here's Damian Williams popping into the game and getting touches at the goal line. Is this something you think we're going to see more of? Is Damian back, or is this kind of 3-headed backfield because Darrell Williams still gets a touch or 2? Is this something we're going to have to worry about as we go forward?
It's just a pain in the butt. That's all it is. 44% of the rushing attempts last week to McCoy, or the week before to McCoy. This past week, 45%. And then Damian Williams, 33% and 35%. So, really, the splits are the same. I don't know how much the fumble had to do with it. That's something that I had also seen on Twitter when I had first posted my utilization report. Some of the followers had said, hey, that basically McCoy was pulled out after, his fumble. And he is a guy that carries the ball away from his body. It's like you've seen him back in his days with Philly. It's like all the time I'm sitting there thinking, how does he not fumble more than he does? It's really
total loaf of bread.
But over the last 2 weeks, Damian Williams is the guy that's gotten the carries inside the 5. So he had an attempt in week 7. He had an attempt in week 8. Darrell Williams also had 2 attempts in week 7. But it's like you said, all of these guys, it does seem that McCoy is the lead rusher. It appears that Damian Williams is a guy they want to use a smidge more in the passing game. And then Darrell Williams is just the third guy that messes everything up, Drake. So it's just, I don't think you can trust any one of these guys, especially until Patrick Mahomes is back, because you basically need the old Chiefs explosive offense to make any one of these limited opportunities good enough that maybe one of them can come away, or 2 of them can come away with a touchdown, in a game. Right now in the current, construction of what the offense looks like with Matt Moore, which wasn't bad. They did a nice job this past weekend, moving the ball against Green Bay early in the game. But it's just something where I don't really trust it, Drake. And even when Holmes is back, I'd rather not be depending on this situation. We really need one of these backs, to kind of end up out of the way. But then once that happens, we'll probably just see Darwin Thompson. He'll be back in the mix, and it'll be 3 guys again. So it's just one of those situations, Drake, where we had hoped that something would provide us clarity eventually, but right now there's no rhyme or reason to it.
They're on bye this week, but the LA Rams, they're really splitting their backfield up. Is what we saw on Sunday. 10 carries for 44 and a touchdown for Todd Gurley, 53% of the snaps. Darrell Henderson, here he comes, 11 for 49, 2 catches for 20 yards, played a little bit less than 50% of the snaps. I think if Darrell Henderson's on your waiver wire, you got to go out and make sure you're picking him up. If you can get him on the cheap from somebody because he's on bye, this is something I love to do, is look at players going on bye. Because a lot of times teams in your league, they'll be like, oh man, I got all these guys on bye. Maybe you flip him a kind of low-end player he can play this week. And, you scoop him on your roster before he really blows up. Player I like a lot. It looks like they're trying to get him involved, Dwayne. And if he does get involved in the second half of the season, I think really good things can happen in terms of a fantasy outlook.
Yeah, I think Darrell Henderson is a priority, add in mid and larger size leagues. You may have some tough calls if you're in a smaller league. Just remember that Malcolm Brown has missed the last 2 games. And the Rams have actually won both of these games. Week 7, they won by 27 points. And in week 8, they won by 14 points. So 2 games where they pretty much capped Todd Gurley and just said, yeah, Todd, we don't want to really, overtax you here, which is what we thought we would probably see when the season started. But inside the 5, Gurley still got the carries. He had 2 attempts inside the 5, week 7, 2 attempts inside the 5 in week 8. His routes per drop back are still holding steady, 58% and 52% versus Darrell Henderson at 29 and 35%. Now, like you said, Henderson did see some targets. He saw 10% this last week, but there's a chance that Henderson passes Malcolm Brown, right, on the pecking order. The thing I like about Darrell Henderson is I think he's a player that you can use more in tandem with a guy like Todd Gurley because he can do some different things, right? And he brings a different element, to the team, whereas Malcolm Brown is more of in the same vein as Todd Gurley. So I think Henderson is a guy that you got to add. I wouldn't put a ton, on him. If I was talking about a percentage of my fab budget, I think, I'm looking at 10 to 15% is probably, the max I would go, because you're going to have a bye week this week. You're not going to be able to use him, unless something, breaks your way. And even if it does, you may still, by that point, let's say Todd Gurley goes down, Malcolm Brown's probably still likely in the mix, but there is that chance that Darrell Henderson, turns into the true number 2 behind Gurley. And if Gurley were to go down, that could obviously be huge for you.
A guy I really like is Josh Reynolds, the young wide receiver for the Rams. Brandon Cooks, unfortunately, the guy just seems to get a concussion walking down the street. I feel bad for the guy. I'm surprised he got off the turf in that Super Bowl concussion against the Eagles a few years ago, but he left the game again this past week. It opened the door for Reynolds. 8 targets, caught 3 of them for 73 yards and a touchdown. If Cooks has to miss some time with these concussions, Reynolds is a guy you can step in there and I think be a really nice wide receiver 3 for fantasy.
Yeah, he had 26% of the targets this last week, because Cook only played 5% of the snaps. He got hurt really early in the game. So Josh Reynolds stepped right in. He played 88% of the snaps. He ran a route on 90% of the dropbacks. Like I said, 26% of the targets. But even more importantly, he saw 2 targets in the end zone. He's a bigger guy. The thing I see, with this Rams offense, and I've written about it, Established the Run for the last couple of weeks straight, is it's just really now this is a 4 to 5 man attack. It's gone are the days where it was just Cooks, Woods, and Kupp. Now it's spread across everyone. And this week, it was Cooper Kupp seeing 32% and Josh Reynolds seeing 26%. Robert Woods, Drake, saw 6%.
My man Bob Woods is lost. He's hanging out in Forest, begging for help.
The last 3 weeks, 13%, 19%, and 6% of the targets. And then Gerald Everett went from 21 to 24, and then he dropped down to 6%. So remember, what do we talk about all the time? Defenses are looking at 3 and 4 weeks of tape whenever they go and they study these players. So the guys that will sometimes emerge in these trends, just about the time you may catch on to a trend, the trend will change, because then a defensive coordinator will say, okay, well, let's take away Gerald Everett. Well, then what happened? It was Josh Reynolds that now turns into the next guy. And then Cooper Kupp has a rebound week where he has 32% of the targets. So with the Rams, it's just going to be something folks are probably going to have to get used to. I think we're going to see 2 or 3 guys. We'll probably see 1 to 2 guys do well each week, a third guy that may do okay, and then there's going to be a 4th guy that's left out that's most likely in people's fantasy lineups just because it's one of the offenses. Even though the Rams aren't playing as well as what we were used to, it's still one of the better offenses due to how bad so many other teams are playing right now.
Let's talk about an offense who is very limited. I've said this all season long. I got to watch them up close this week because they played my beloved Eagles, and that's the Buffalo Bills. And so you have an inaccurate, very erratic quarterback. You have an old running back in Frank Gore. You don't have any real weapons on the outside, but you have one kind of special player in the backfield in Singletary, and he kind of shined. 7 touches. He had 4 receptions, 49 yards, and a touchdown. Played 68% of the snaps to Gore's 29%. Is this a changing of the guard in Buffalo? They feel the need to get their explosive weapon on the field, because without him, they don't have much.
No, this was simply a game script thing. They lost the game by 18 points. Your Eagles pounded them.
Into submission.
Yeah, the Eagles got out on them. And this was a game where the downfield passing attack just wasn't there. I mean, what were the winds, Drake? You had 20 mile-an-hour winds, 50-mile-an-hour gusts. So, I mean, the deep passing game was just not a thing that either team could really depend on. So it became a check down game. And Frank Gore in a script where the Bills were trailing, he only played 29% of the snaps, but we saw that earlier in the season. Remember when Devin Singletary first popped onto the scene? What was it? We saw it in a game script that got really close where the Bills were trying to come back and Singletary saw more playing time. He is the pass receiving back. He ran a route on 72% of the drop back streak and he saw 18% of the targets, but he only ran 15. He only had 15% of the team rushes, whereas Gore had 45% and the rest went to Josh Allen. So this is something where Singletary is going to have value in games that are closer or when the Bills are trailing, but otherwise it's going to be tough to have him in your fantasy lineup.
Let's stay in the AFC East, Mohamed Sanu was picked up in a trade from Atlanta to New England this week. Still, it's the Julian Edelman show. He's catching touchdowns left and right, 11 targets. Dorsett, 93% of the playing time. And Sanu with 59%. I don't know if that's, Dwain, because he's new or because they're just trying to find a role for him, because Edelman is the slot. And he's not really an outside threat. So I don't think for fantasy, and a lot of people have made this point, it's a better football move than a fantasy football move. But if you have Mohamed Sanu, are you worried about playing him week to week in New England?
Yeah, I mean, he's not a guy that I'm rushing to have out there. I do expect his snaps to climb. I think he'll end up being in the 80%, range of snaps, because I think what they will clearly do now that they have three guys that they trust, I think 11 will become their base personnel, right? You're not rushing to get, Eric Tomlinson and Matt Lacoste once he's healthy and Ryan Izzo. I mean,
no, you aren't.
Yeah. You're not rushing to get, you're not rushing to get these guys on the field, right? I mean, if I'm the Patriots. So I think Edelman, Dorsett, and Sanu will be their base set. The guy that I'm the most excited about, Drake, is who you mentioned. Edelman obviously is the key guy, but Dorsett, he ran a route on 100% of Tom Brady's dropbacks for the second consecutive week. He saw 17% of the targets. He's had an end zone target in each of the last two games. He's tied for first on the team with 25% of the end zone targets for the season. So, and he's a guy that we know can get deep. So teams start to try to bracket Edelman and do other things with him. The guy that I think, is most likely to, take advantage of that is going to be Philip Dorsett.
I love him. The guy runs a 4.240. He's the only real field stretcher that they have at this point. And Harry still hasn't seen the field yet. So if they're going to do a shot play, it's going to be to Philip Dorsett, you'd think.
Yeah, because Mohamed Sanu this last week, his average depth of target was 5.2, Drake. So, I mean, he's working in the same place as Julian Edelman, who's a 7.8, a 7.0. But Dorsett is the guy that's working downfield. The last 2 weeks, his average depth of target has been 16.7 and 12.5, 13.2 on the season. And he's the guy that can line up outside wide, and still stretch the boundary, vertically for the rest of your team and open up some of these other things, which they're using him to do. But as teams try to take away some of these underneath options, he could see some really good looks, moving forward. And he and Brady seem to have some chemistry going. So Dorsett is a guy that in your deeper type leagues, he really should, be rostered, because as the Patriots start to get into some games that are just tougher, that they can't just walk all over. New England's been great, but let's face it. I mean, they haven't played anybody, really. I mean, they played the Bills. That was a decent game. But really, with what we know about Cleveland now, and how bad Baker Mayfield is, Baker Mayfield's one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL right now, and New England's been feasting on bad quarterbacks. So let's see what happens this next week against the Ravens.
You think Marlon Humphrey matches up with Edelman? Think they throw him inside?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I would have to go look again at what the Ravens have been doing. I know Humphrey is stud. He is their main guy, but they also have Peters now. They've still, I mean, Jimmy Smith, I don't know when he'll be back, but they have Brandon Carr. They've got multiple good corners, so I don't know how much they'll have to have guys travel, around. My guess is they might have Humphrey play Dorsett. Dorsett is the guy that, could beat you with one play, and they may do some different things, on the inside with some different coverages to try to stop Julian Edelman, with one of, they have some other good corners too, and they could potentially do some brackets, things like that, and then maybe single up Dorsett with Humphrey. But, I would have to look more at that.
This defense should be better. I mean, Baltimore is a fine team, but look at the players they have on the back end of this defense.
Well, and they're still gelling, right? This is a team that still hasn't fully gelled. I mean, it's like you said, these guys are mostly all new. I mean, Earl Thomas is new to the equation. Peters is new to the equation. You know, they just last week was his. Well, they were on bye this past week, but he had his first game the week before, which he had a touchdown. I think he had a defensive touchdown that week. So we'll have to see, you know, how they do. Obviously, you know, they're a very analytically minded football team. You know, we heard the argument this offseason of how coverage is greater than pass rush, and they're clearly loading up on coverage players. You know, there were rumors that they were involved, you know, trying to get in on the sweepstakes for Jalen Ramsey as well. So we'll see what happens with them.
I tweeted earlier this year that DK Metcalf is going to win people fantasy leagues. You laughed at me, Dwayne. You mocked my fantasy football acumen, but now I'm hitting on this. I called the LaShawn McCoy to Kansas City trade, and now I'm going to be correct with DK Metcalf. You wanted to talk about DK and Rashad Penny for the Seahawks here, so lay it on us.
Yeah, the biggest thing with Metcalf, you know, is we talked about over the last few weeks, he had seen a downturn as David Moore had returned to the lineup. Metcalf had seen his snaps and also seen his routes per drop back go down. Well, this last week, or over these last 3 weeks, we've seen Metcalf trend back upward in his routes per drop back, 76%, 82%, and 96%. You know, his targets have gone from 15 to 20 to 25% over the last 3 weeks. And he's got 5 end zone targets in the last 3 weeks. He's got 12 end zone targets on the season, which is one of the top in the NFL. So he's a guy that they're not only just trying to stretch the field to, but they're also using him as they get closer to the goal line, or as they get down into the red zone. So Metcalf is a guy that, you know, his team isn't going to pass the ball, you know, a ton. They only dropped back to pass 44% of the plays this last week, 65% the week before, 55% the week before that. So they're only sitting at 56% on the season, which is below the league average. But he's being used in high leverage situations because his average depth of target is 15.3. So you guys that know Josh Hermsmeyer, you know how important air yards are. So that's big for Metcalf. He's the guy that's leading the team in air yards, and he's also the guy that is leading the team in those targets in the end zone, and we're seeing an upward trend with him. So, I mean, he's squarely in the wide receiver 3 with upside, conversation right now moving forward. The only thing really holding him back, Drake, is just the volume. You know, in these games where, you know, the Seahawks don't have to throw, we know that clearly they won't. The guy that's the odd man sitting out really isn't David Moore. It was just this last week they just decided not to use Jerron Brown. He only played 28% of the snaps. He only ran a route on 29% of the dropbacks, saw 0% of the targets. But David Moore was actually on the field 48% of the time. You know, he saw 20% of the targets. So it was Lockett at 30%. It was Metcalf at 25% and David Moore at 20%. And that might be their recipe moving forward because they're still trying to figure out how to replace those targets that they lost when Will Disley went down for the season. Rashad Penny, just a quick note. This last week, it does appear that he's finally healthy. Not a player you've got to rush out and get, but in mid-sized, deeper leagues, he's still a decent stash because this is a team that likes to run the ball a ton, and they're pretty effective at it. But he had 30% of the snap streak, 24% of the rushing attempts, which is his highest number. 24%. That's his highest number since week 2. Now he's missed some time with his hamstring issue. And then CJ Prosise just didn't get on the field at all, 0% of the snaps. So it was just Carson and Penny. And Penny he ran a route on 33% of the dropbacks. He did see a rushing attempt inside 5 this past week as well. Chris Carson also had 1. So Rashad Penny is a guy that, you know, similar to the Darrell Henderson vein, you know, he's a good guy, you know, to stash. He could potentially be worth more. If Chris Carson were to go down, you know, he's obviously immediately in the RB2 with upside mix on a week-to-week basis.
All right. We always know tight end is a wasteland. Let me throw a few guys at you who are probably on your wire as you go to bed tonight. And when you wake up, you hope that nice Christmas present is under your tree when you turn your phone on and go, oh, who did I get? Who landed in my roster today? So Dallas Goedert over the last 3 weeks has 37.9 PPR points. Zach Ertz has 19.2. All right. Now, Ertz actually has 1 more target, but Goddard is making the most of them because he has 2 scores. Now, the Eagles are playing primarily in their base offense of 12 personnel. So they're running the ball a ton, and Goddard is staying on the field. Is this something you're seeing also, Dwayne?
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be interesting to see what happens when Deshaun Jackson comes back, because that would mean Nelson Aguilar is going to be the odd man out and wouldn't be on the field.
What a shame.
If they do believe Dallas Goedert is the way they would want to go instead of Aguilar, and I would think they would. But to your point, yeah, if you look at the last 3 weeks, Ertz target rate 20%, 19 and 17, Goddard 20, 15 and 17. And the bigger thing is on the year, Goddard has 4 end zone targets and Ertz only has 1. And Goddard's missed 2 games, Drake, or did he just miss 1? I can't remember off the top of my head.
He's missed 2.
Yeah, so I mean, over the last 2 weeks, he's got 2 targets in the end zone, whereas Ertz has 0. So this is something where if you're an Ertz owner, this hurts. This is hurting you.
Yeah,
because
they're double teaming Ertz. That's really what it is. Their offense is so compressed without Deshaun Jackson because they can't stretch the field that they know Ertz is the only option, and they're double teaming him. And Goddard's getting fantastic matchups.
So it'll be interesting to see if they start paying more attention to Goddard. You could see things come back for Ertz. But what I think will happen is once Deshaun Jackson comes back, hopefully that opens things up, for both of these guys. But I think, your real question here is Dallas Goedert worth owning, right? Is he worth rostering in fantasy, and can you trust him in your lineup? And my thought process around that is right now, I mean, yeah, his routes per dropback aren't great at 51, 42, and 55%. But target shares of 20, 15, and 17%, it's kind of hard to ignore because the Eagles are one of the teams that they will run, some decent play volumes. And the other thing I'll say is that those numbers have come in games where the Eagles have been getting beat by a lot. And those have also come in games where the Eagles have been winning by a lot. So it hasn't really mattered the game script. Goddard has been involved. So it is something that if for some reason teams adjust and start trying to take Goddard away, it's going to be a problem because he's not on the field enough. But if you really are in a pinch and tied it in at tight end, this is a decent offense. He has a good quarterback. And while, I preach, hey, getting guys on the field is what matters the most. And it's not that his snaps are terrible, Drake. His snaps last week, 75%.
Yeah, they're playing 2 tight end, 75% of the game.
He still stays in the block, more than what Ertz does, 55% routes per dropback on a 75% snap share. But I mean, it's a good enough offense that I think if you need a tight end that you can put in and say, your other option is, like a Vance McDonald, or somebody like that, I'll be honest at this point, I would lean Goddard.
This week you get Mitch Trubisky against the Eagles secondary. And I tweeted earlier this week, that is like Hulk Hogan against Andre the Giant in WrestleMania 3. The irresistible force against the immovable object. Which will give first? I can't wait to be in attendance at the link and watch this disaster unfold. All right, if you're looking for another tight end, how about Jonnu Smith, okay? Delaney Walker has been out, and in the time that Jonnu Smith is in, last week, 7 targets, caught 6 of them for 78 yards and a touchdown. That's 3 50-plus yard games out of his last 4. And he's going to have a role, I think, with Tannehill in there, even if Delaney Walker comes back. But if Delaney Walker sits this week, Jonnu Smith, fire him up. He is going to be a difference maker in an offense that really doesn't have a whole lot of options.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was a guy that was a great play this last week in DFS. He kind of saved, my weekend and gave me basically a small win instead of a loss because I used a ton of Jonnu in my lineups. But I mean, he's a guy that, like you said, I mean, he and Tannehill seem to be on the same page. You've talked about this before, the 2 backups, right, Drake?
Yep.
The matchup that they get, this weekend is versus Carolina. It's slightly negative for tight ends, in a PPR format, but it's not, something that you're just super scared of. So yeah, I have no problem with firing up Jonnu Smith. If you think about, if I were picking between him or Goddard, as long as Delaney Walker's out, I would fire up, Jonnu, probably first. But they're still close. I mean, this past week, Jonnu had 21% of the targets and his routes per dropback, 50%.
How about Darren Fells? This breakout here in his mid-30s, another 2 touchdown week. This guy's got a double-digit PPR points 4 of his last 6 games. He's got an incredible quarterback throwing to him. What's not to like here? If you're really dead at tight end, fire up Darren Fells, throw him in. I mean, they're either throwing to Hopkins or Fells. That's it.
Yeah, and I wasn't able to find anything on Jordan Akins to see like if there was anything going on with him. But this last week,
he got deported.
This last week, Darren Fells, 90% of the snaps, whereas the week before had been 65%. Now, he did have 89% the week before that, but he had his season high in routes per dropback, 72%, Drake. So, and then he had 15% target share. So that's 2 weeks out of the last 3 where he's gotten 15% of the targets or more, which isn't, it's not great, but it's not bad for tight end. Your receivers, you want to see at a higher number than that.
Mm-hmm.
And he had 2 targets inside, or he had 2 targets in the end zone this past week. He's got 5 on the season, which is 29% of the end zone targets for the Texans. So yeah, he's a guy that it won't surprise me, if he dips back down, the next week. It's going to be hard to predict when. But yeah, I mean, he continues to have, every other week or so, he has this up week. And I don't think he's done. I don't think it's something where it's just going to go away. But I do think it's going to be hard to predict which weeks it's going to come on.
Of those 3 guys I mentioned, Goddard, Fells, Smith, you got to put a claim in for one. How are you going to prioritize them?
Well, it depends on Delanie Walker. But if let's say Delanie Walker is questionable and we think he may come back, I'm going Goddard first. Then I'm going, I'm going Goddard first, then I'm going Fells, and then I'm going, Jonnu Smith. But if we think that, it's looking more like Delanie Walker is not going to play, then I would go Goddard, then Jonnu Smith, and then I would go with Fells. And the reason for that,
jersey.
Yeah. Well, the reason for that is that Goddard has established a role even with a healthy tight end in front of him, right? That's been the most consistent, of the 3. Jonnu Smith carries the highest 1 week upside if, we've got a situation where Delanie Walker doesn't play. And then Darren Fells, he's similar to Goddard. He seems to have carved out a role, but we don't have a strong enough trend right now to say that it's going to be predictable. So, you can end up with a goose egg or you can end up, with 15 points.
If you are playing DFS this week and you're into cash games, I do a cash game podcast with my man Nick Valinchak. Check it out. It's called Eat the Chalk. Just search us on Twitter at Eat the Chalk DFS, or go on iTunes and look it up at Eat the Chalk. And if you're into super nerdy stat and data stuff, Dwain does a hell of a show with our boy Jay Moyer. I always mess the name up, Dwain, so I'll let you promo it.
Yeah, it's the Fantasy Film and Data podcast. It's under the RSP under Matt Waldman. So you can find it at the RSP. So mattwaldmanrsp.com. Anybody else you want to touch base on here? No, man, I think we hit a ton of guys. There are a few other guys that I hit, if folks want to go, read the article over at Establish the Run, there's a few more nuggets in there. Also, you can check out my Twitter feed at Dwain McFarland. That's DWAIN. I did a utilization report on all of the teams that played. I've had busy 2 weeks before this and had a lot of folks saying, hey, we want to see the utilization report. So had to make sure that I hit all the teams this weekend. I haven't hit the 2 teams from Monday night. I don't know that I will, Drake, just because they make me want to vomit, Miami and Pittsburgh. But nothing against those teams. It's just, with where they are from a standpoint of, quarterbacking and, the rest of the team. But if people want more, you can go check that out on my feed.
Yep. Use our promo code at Establish the Run, Hustle20. You'll save 20% on a weekly, monthly, or season-long package over there. I check it out every day. It's great stuff. You can read my work over at fightingchancefantasy.com. I participate in a round table. I'm leading the website in my gambling predictions. I never have done that before. I'm not a good gambler, so God only knows how this is happening, but fightingchancefantasy.com. You can check out all that good stuff over there. Follow me on Twitter at Drake Fantasy. Again, he is at Dwain McFarland. And please, 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 if you love the show, you listen to this podcast, go on iTunes or wherever you find the show, like it, review it, 5 stars, tell a friend to tell a friend. It helps us out immensely and grows the show. So for Dwain McFarland of Establish the Run, I am Brian Drake. Have a great night, everybody, and enjoy week 9. I'll see you in Philadelphia, beer in hand. Take it easy.